Hi, we'll go ahead and get started in about 2 or 3 minutes. Let some people come by. Thank you, everybody, for joining. All right, maybe we'll go ahead and get started now. I'm Jody Noll. I want to thank everybody for joining today. We're here to talk about my book, the 1968 statewide Florida teacher strike, the public sector unionism, and the fight against Sunshine State conservatism. Just kind of wanted to get the blurriness out, show a picture. This is one of the more famous pictures of the strike, which is on the cover of the book, but it's not actually of the strike. It's of the Tangerine Bowl meeting that happened in 1967, and I'll get into that in just a little bit. This project has been a very long labor of love. I actually began it as an undergraduate at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg. I was looking for a topic on to write my senior honors thesis. I was taking Gary Mormino, a famous Florida historian's history of food class. When I came across the 1968 Florida teacher strike, I thought it would make an excellent honors thesis. And then it has carried me on to graduate school, my master's thesis, my dissertation, and now finally in book form. So it's been this really kind of exciting process that began roughly in 2010, and I've been working on it for about 15 years ever since then. Um, what I want to do today is really kind of pinpoint three big topics or three big aspects of the story of the strike. And why I think the strike is such a fascinating story is because it's not just about this kind of 3 week period in Florida beginning in February 19th, 1968. It can tell us a lot about the rise of modern conservatism, Florida's central role in how modern conservatism and the modern Republican Party was able to take hold of the previously kind of democratic stronghold of the South. It tells us a lot about teacher activism and activism in general, and how teachers can be at the forefront of social and labor movements. And ultimately, it also tells us about the building of a modern Florida and how Florida moved away from some of its more rural, deep South roots and became the Florida that we really know today. And so, for this talk, I'll talk about 20 minutes. I'm going to discuss the election of Claude Kirk, the education crisis of 1967, and the strike itself, which is roughly about 3 chapters from the book, because I give a lot of background information on education within the South or within Florida and the political climate in Florida before the 1968 Florida teacher strike. But in order to really understand the roots of the strike, we have to kind of look towards Claude Kirk, who is a Republican governor. He's elected in 1966, and he's the first Republican governor elected not just in Florida since Reconstruction, but in the Deep South as well. And Kirk really changes the political game within Florida. Florida, like all other southern states, is pretty much controlled by the rural Democratic Party. And Kirk comes in at a time when Florida's seeing this kind of rapid change. The 1950s and the 1960s, Florida's witnessing one of their largest population booms in a state that is constantly seeing population booms. Um, One through the baby boom generation, but also through transplants. So you've got retirees who are moving to the state to enjoy the warm weather, the sunshine, and also the no state income tax. But you also are beginning to see the state growing in industry, especially on the Space Coast. So beginning in the 1950s and 1960s, you see a large number of professionals, especially people such as engineers, who are moving down to kind of work the space industry, the war industry during the Cold War, and all of these things. And what they are doing is they're helping to change the political climate in Florida. Many of these transplants are Republicans. And once they get down to Florida, they realize that the state is controlled, is malapportioned, meaning that a very small portion of the population actually has the largest number of legislators. And so there, what you see is this kind of dynamic that is occurring within the state in the 1960s of the Democratic Party is really dominating state politics, and they're dominating it through malapportionment, and they're dominating it, and they have this group known as the Pork Chop Gang, which is a group of rural legislators, mostly in North Central Florida, North Florida, and the Panhandle, who control most of the state's politics. And these transplants are pushing back against it. The other group that are pushing back against it are the urban liberals, people who are living in places such as Miami, who do not want this kind of conservative Democratic Party to control the state any longer. And with these tensions that we begin to see, this is going to leave an opening for Claude Kirk and his election to the governor's house in 1966. Now, Kirk is a fascinating figure. Kirk was a political outsider. He was, like most Floridians at this time, not actually from Florida. He lived most of his life in Alabama, and he moved to Florida in the 1950s, like many Floridians, to kind of find his fortune. He founds an insurance company and is really wildly successful in this insurance business. And he begins to use the money and the capital and the business skills that he gained to gain more political prominence within the state. Um, but even still, in the 1966 gubernatorial election, Kirk is a political outsider. He has very little political experience, and he's a Republican. So he's seen as an incredible long shot to actually win the election because the Democratic Party still controls the South. What happens is kind of some of these tensions come to the head and help open up a space for Kirk to talk. And what this means is that you have the Democratic primary in 66. And historically, from Reconstruction to this point, the Democratic primary is seen as basically the election. Whoever's going to win the Democratic primary will win the election. A Republican does not have a chance to win it. And you have two politicians who I think, who in a lot of ways are representative of some of the fractures that you're beginning to see in the state. You have the incumbent Democratic governor, Hayden Burns, who's a part of this rural legislature, the pork chop gang. And you have and he's much more conservative. And then you have a liberal minded Democrat, Robert King High, who comes from Miami. And so this primary becomes this really nasty drag out fight for honestly what many thought would be the future of the Democratic Party in the state of Florida. And High, surprising some, actually wins this primary. And when he wins the primary, it fractures the Democratic Party even more. Burns is going to refuse to endorse him, and a lot of these conservative Democrats, especially in areas such as the Panhandle, North Florida, and North Central Florida, are going to not support High. And so this fracture leaves an opening for this man by the name of Claude Kirk, or as David Halberstam refers to, a political happening known as Claude Kirk. Now, like I said, Claude Kirk is a businessman, he is a political outsider, and that is his biggest appeal to the constituency of Florida, is that he isn't part of this old guard. He isn't a career politician. He's this political outsider with a business acumen who wants to sell his vision to Floridians for the future of the state. And Kirk has what I refer to in the book, a kind of implements what I refer to in the book as sunshine conservatism. And what sometimes conservatism is, and it mirrors a lot of what Ronald Reagan does, is it helps build the Southern strategy for Nixon to ultimately win the South in the later presidential election. Kirk wants low taxes. He wants small government when it comes to kind of social security or social welfare system, but he wants a large government to support businesses. So basically, what Kirk is doing is he's supporting corporate welfare over because he thinks that this will encourage more and more industries to move down to Florida. He wants to turn Florida into the economic epicenter of the world, taking it away from New York City. And so he thinks that providing them with incentives will help Florida kind of become this economic epicenter. The other key feature to Kirk's political ideology is this business model of efficiency as a form of governance. Kirk views the government as well, in other aspects of it, especially education, as a business. And that in order for it to maximize the investment that Floridians are making through their tax dollars, you have to run it as efficiently as possible. And so once High defeats Burns, it still seems like High from the Miami liberal is going to win this election fairly easily. But the Republican Party, the National Republican Party, really starts to take notice of Claude Kirk. They bring in one of their biggest political campaign strategists, a man aptly named Robert E. Lee. And Lee comes down there after winning some monumental victories in Colorado. He comes down there. He has this great quote where he says, "Before I met Claude Kirk, if you told me a Republican candidate could win in Florida, I would tell you you were smoking opium. After 4 days with Claude Kirk, he has sold me on his vision. The Republican Party can take the South, and Claude Kirk will be the man to lead us there." And so this is like a really salient kind of message that he's giving to a lot of Floridians, especially the transplants who are moving from the Midwest and the North. And one of the biggest features of Kirk's campaign is actually improving education. It's important to understand that Florida's education system at this time was in serious decline. This massive influx of population, especially with young professionals who are bringing their children in, is creating poor infrastructure. The schools aren't able to handle all of these new students, large class sizes, and the tax structure that they had in place that 20 years earlier was actually seen as this kind of great moment is already out of date. And so Kirk recognizes that in order to turn Florida into this kind of economic epicenter that he dreams of, one of the key features will have to be a good education system. And so he actually campaigns on turning Florida into the #1 education system in the country, right? We're going to make education #1 is a large campaign of his. But his ideas on education really conflict with the teachers, who already at this point are demanding massive reforms. And what teachers are really demanding during this time period is first, what they want is increased funding to improve schools because they say they're working in decrepit schools where cockroaches, animals fall throughout, are all over the place. There's stories of people falling through the roof. Or through the ceiling on second floors. There's many teachers are saying we don't even have air conditioning in schools. And if you've been in Florida, air conditioning in schools is a pretty important thing to have. They're saying that we have overcrowded classrooms, out-of-date textbooks. We need more funding in order to improve our profession, in order for us to actually be able to properly educate the state's youth. And there's other factors at play here, but this is all coming to a head really in 1967 once Kirk wins the election and he takes over Tallahassee. And when Kirk takes over Tallahassee, almost immediately the teachers begin to combat his ideas. Because what Kirk's ideas are to improve education is not to increase taxes, nor to increase funding. Instead, he wants to place business people, or businessmen using kind of the terminology of the time, into places of administrative power. And he thinks that these business people will be able to run the education system much more efficiently, and in doing so, will negate the need for increased funding. The other thing that he's desperate to do is to try and prevent Florida's teachers from unionizing, because that's a major aspect of what the teachers are wanting to do. They want collective bargaining rights for their organization, the Florida Education Association, because they argue that this will give them more autonomy and more power within their profession. And if they have more autonomy and more power within their profession, and it's not just politicians or business people like Kirk wants making educational decisions, then education will actually improve for the students of Florida. And so 67 becomes this really big moment where 67 is going to become this really big moment where you can see the seeds of dissent coming from Florida's teachers. They don't agree with Kirk's plans, especially the ideas of bringing business leaders in. Kirk says that education is run by what he refers to as educrats, so basically bureaucrats, but educators who don't understand how to run a business, right? So he wants to bring non-educators in. He wants to kind of see an immediate return on the investment of education. And he wants to cut what he thinks is a bunch of inefficient waste. And teachers, along with their organization, the Florida Education Association, as well as the national organization, the National Education Association, or the NEA, immediately begin to fight back against Kirk. One of Kirk's first calls to improve education is to implement a plan of merit pay and stripping away of teacher tenure, which directly conflicts with teachers' demands, because they're saying that it's not the teachers who are the problem, it's our lack of funding and the fact that we don't have the resources that are providing us the opportunity to properly educate the state's children. In kind of early spring, the NEA places sanctions. Early spring of 67, the NEA places sanctions against the state of Florida. They tell any teachers who are a member of the NEA that they cannot move to the state to teach, and they notify all business leaders in Florida that Claude Kirk is not trying to improve education. And so 67 really becomes this kind of war of words between the Florida Education Association's leadership and Claude Kirk. And it's a battle that is playing out within the media. And the media is largely supportive of teachers and the FEA at first, because they say that it's very clear that education is not improving, and it doesn't seem like Kirk has much of a plan to improve it, because funding is something that is drastically needed. The summer of 67, you see a lot of back and forth dialogue, but it becomes more and more clear, especially to the teachers, not necessarily their organizational leadership of the FEA, that drastic action may have to happen. And so that leads us to, again, the picture of the book, the Tangerine Bowl meeting. Sorry, it's kind of blurry. The Tangerine Bowl meeting. And in August 1967, over 35,000 teachers flocked to this rally. This is a union rally. And what I really love about the picture as well is it shows a crucial feature of the strike and teacher organization at this time, which is that it was an interracial organization and it was an interracial strike at a time when Florida's schools were almost exclusively still segregated. So you're bringing black and white teachers together for the very first time. At the Tangerine Bowl meeting, teachers are ready to go on strike. What I think is really important to note about this is that it is illegal for teachers to go on strike within the state of Florida, even in 1968. And so instead, they come up with the idea that we will resign en masse, effectively creating what they refer to as a walkout. All teachers at the rally sign letters of resignation, and they start to chant things such as resign now, strike now. But FEA leadership, FEA leadership still has a message of caution. Phil Constance, who's the field secretary for the FEA, gives a speech where he says now is not the time to strike. Invoking the words of Martin Luther King, he asks teachers to turn the other cheek because he thinks a strike will be largely detrimental for Florida's teachers. And the NEA and the FEA have yet to ever support a strike at this moment. So they get this message of caution and they say, okay, we're not going to send in at the Tangerine Bowl meeting, we're not going to send in our letters of resignation, but we want Kirk to create a task force to look at how we can improve education, and we want him to bring up or to call for a special legislative session. After this meeting, the rhetoric from Kirk becomes even more inflammatory. He refers to teachers as traitors to their country. He refers to them as traitors to their children. And he begins to go on this campaign saying that what this is a union who is trying to force teachers to go on strike, that the teachers don't actually want to go on strike, and this is all about union control within the state. This couldn't be further from the truth. As my book talks about, it's not union officials in the NEA or the FEA who's pushing for a strike. In fact, it's the teachers who are the ones who are pushing for the strike. And this happens for a lot of different reasons, and I'll talk about that in just 1 minute. Fall of 67 continues like much of the rest of the year. You really see this kind of tension between the two groups, and a battle of public opinion really plays out within the media. This leads us to October, where teachers again get fed up with a lack of what they see of action from Kirk, and they say it's time. We're going to hold another Tangerine rally, and this is when we're going to sign our letters. We're going to send in our letters of resignation. This actually forces Kirk to the real negotiating table, because Kirk has national ambitions. He wants to be Nixon's vice presidential candidate, and he thinks a statewide strike will be heavily detrimental to his national political ambitions. And so Kirk agrees to call a legislative session in January 1968. And so from October, November, December, there is this moment of hope that things might actually get better. And this hope comes crashing to a halt during the special legislative session of 1968. Kirk opens the speech where he constantly talks about how business efficiency, not funding, is what is going to improve education. But the legislature does actually vote to raise taxes. They say we're going to raise taxes, and we're going to raise them to $250 million, all in the name of education. Unfortunately, only about 40% of the dollars that they voted to approve would be allocated to education. So the teachers aren't necessarily happy with this tax plan, although it does seem like they're willing to work around it. But then Kirk announces that he will never sign a tax increase himself. Because he ran on not raising taxes. And once Kirk says that he will veto this bill immediately, the teachers feel like they have no choice but to go on strike. And on February 19th, 1968, they send in their letters of resignation. And this is a really difficult decision. And the oral histories that I used within this book are really demonstrate how difficult of a decision it was for many of these teachers to go on strike or not to go on strike. William Bottom, who was actually a principal, I interviewed him. He talked about it was the most difficult decision of his life. This interview happened almost 50 years after the strike, and he was still crying over that. He talked about how he lost his best friend because they agreed to go on strike, and then his best friend didn't go on strike. He also discussed how he wasn't going to get paid for 3 weeks or while he was on strike. And his wife was a teacher herself, but she was on leave because they had just had a child, and that they couldn't even afford their hospital bills. Teachers who didn't go on strike, such as Lenny Simidor and Mary Frances Allmiller, they talked about how they, in a lot of ways, supported the teachers who went on strike, but they felt like they had to honor their contract. Now, the strike itself lasts a period of 3 weeks. And during this period, I think it's a very difficult time for the striking teachers. The public and the media, the mainstream media, especially more white newspapers, really attack the teachers. They're attacking them, accusing them of shirking their duty, playing up to ideas of women or teachers as women and emotional caretakers, saying they're abandoning their children. And Kirk is also going to play up on these gendered notions of teachers. And what the teachers are saying is, and I think what's important to understand is that this is a new influx of teachers. So you have a very large young teaching population at this time period. Many of them who by 68 had gone to college, had either participated in or witnessed other forms of social activism, such as the civil rights movement, such as the students' rights movement and the anti-war movement, and they can see how activism works. It's a very large women-dominated workforce. And so these women are fighting against kind of notions of female passivity, right? And by the mere act of going on strike, they are placing themselves directly kind of in the beginnings of second wave feminism. The strike does last for only 3 weeks. And like I said, it's a difficult moment for the teachers. And after 3 weeks, the teachers are really distraught. they're asking the union to finally sit down with Claude Kirk because they're not getting the support that they want. They weren't able to shut down the schools. Kirk, his vision of teachers, sees them as more as babysitters. In fact, one of his top campaign officials says that teaching is a second-rate profession, that no man worth anything would ever become a teacher. And so they place unqualified substitutes basically to keep the schools open. The only people who really do support the teachers really are the students. And you see students actually partaking in walkouts. Some students are arrested in Brevard County for those things as well, for walking out and for truancy. But without the public support, the teachers feel like they don't have much of a chance to gain any victories. And after 3 weeks, they go to the negotiating table and they come up with what I argue is actually some pretty large victories for these teachers. And what I want everybody to understand is the strike for a very long time was seen as a massive loss for Florida's teachers. But I don't think that is the case. The first thing they do is they force Claude Kirk to sign, at that time, the largest tax increase in the history of Florida. So you have a governor who said he will never raise taxes, now signing the largest tax increase in the history of Florida. They gain extra funding for the remainder of the year. They negotiate for most of the teachers to be able to be rehired. And it doesn't happen immediately, but in the summer of 1968, even as the strike, because you're seeing kind of the strike occur still in some areas, but as the statewide strike is over, the state legislature writes into the state constitution that all public sector employees now have the state constitutionally protected right to collectively bargain. And this is monumental because teachers now and all public sector employees in Florida have the legal right to unionize. This is coming from a state that was the first state to enact right to work laws, one of the most anti-union states in the country, becoming the first state in the South to protect collective bargaining rights for public sector employees. They do also place a no strike provision into the Constitution saying public sector employees are not able to go on strike. However, I like to remind people that it was illegal for them to go on strike in 68 as well. And so I think the legacy of the strike really centers on these collective bargaining rights, but it also tells us a lot about the rise of modern conservatism and how Claude Kirk becomes this instrumental figure in the South's turn to the Republican Party. The other thing that I just kind of want to end on and is a quote from Emma Evers. Emma Evers was a Black teacher who went on strike. And it's the last quote in my book. And Evers, throughout these oral histories that were conducted in a dissertation that I used for my, by Erica Gruberman, that I used for this book, often Evers talks oftentimes about how this created interracial bonds that she did not think existed. But this is what she says about the strike, and this is what I'll finish on. Reflecting on her participation, Emma Evers summed up the strike by recalling that what I did was from my heart. I enjoyed it. Changes were made and history was made, and I am a part of that history. And it's those changes, such as collective bargaining rights, that I think still reverberate within the state of Florida. Thank you very much. I guess now is the time for questions, if we have any questions.
That's great. Thank you. So our first question at the beginning of this, you discussed the way that this project has sort of evolved over a period of years. Can you talk a little bit more about how that's happened, how it kind of looked at the beginning, differences from sort of the beginning to now, and how that process has worked?
Yeah, that's a great question. It started as a undergrad honors thesis. I think it was titled For the Students. I made this argument that I wasn't really looking at the political aspects of the strike at that time. My kind of historiographical knowledge wasn't built up yet, but I argued that this was not a strike about teacher pay, that this was a decision for the teachers to go on strike because they felt that they had to support their students. As I kind of moved forward in my career, once I went to Auburn, I worked with Dr. Jenny Brooks, and she actually pushed me to continue my work on the strike. And I really looked at some of the kind of political aspects of what this meant and looked at the changing political culture within Florida and how the strike provides a lens of Florida's kind of the building of a more modern political Florida. And then once I turned it to the dissertation, I began to actually look at the teachers a little bit more. Um, and I explore concepts of what the famous teacher union leader Albert Shanker referred to as teacher power, and examining how this kind of way, how the strike helped create this wave of teacher activism through not just through the South, but throughout the country as well. And so it's just kind of I just built upon these concepts and expanding it to really understand broader political, social, economic, and labor moments within the history of the United States.
Thank you. You also talked about briefly about student support for the teachers, and how that was one of the only places where the teachers sort of felt they were receiving support. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how you came across that information and kind of just give us more details on that?
Yeah, so I came across it first just reading letters to Governor Kirk as well as the Deputy of Education Floyd Christian, and a lot of the letters that were coming from families were really opposing the strike, but a lot of them from students were saying that, look, we're going to these schools. This is not a good education that we're receiving, and the teachers are doing everything that they possibly can. And if we don't support them, like it's very clear that they need our support. And so it comes from a lot of letters where they're talking about this. There's one great letter I read where it's this very, very eloquent letter from a high school student saying that the substitutes that she has to have are incredibly unqualified. She's not receiving a good education, and that the teachers were providing her with a great education before they went on strike, but the state was not supporting the teachers. But then at the end of the letter, she just has this kind of postscript that says, P.S. Also, my brother goes to an elementary school, and the school can't even afford straws for his milk. And I find that incredibly shameful, which is just, I think that always just kind of makes me laugh because you have this very kind of political moment and then a child also thinking about straws for their milk. I also did some oral histories, one with Gary Cornwell, who actually was a student. In Brevard County at the time, and he tells the story of when they went on strike, or when they walked out on a solidarity strike. But Gary also noted that it was 68, right? That they supported the teachers, but everybody was this atmosphere of protest, and he saw the strike as just like his support for the civil rights movement, for the anti-war movement, for students' rights movement, and for the beginnings of first wave feminism. And then the New York Times, I found this great article in the New York Times talking about how I think 15 students from Brevard County were arrested for truancy because they walked out. And so you can see a lot of it through letters, oral histories, and newspaper articles.
Thank you. So you talked a little bit just now about an individual story that you found intriguing from a student letter. Do you have any other favorite sort of stories of individuals that you came across in your research that really stand out to you as being especially compelling?
Yeah, I find the story of Claude Kirk compelling, but it's not, it's a letter that he found. I guess there's two. One is from a letter. I don't actually know anything about the individual who wrote the letter, but he was a soldier who was fighting in Vietnam, and he wrote the letter from Vietnam. And he said, I am over here fighting for our country. And this is directed to Claude Kirk, and I can't trust the governor of my state to provide education for my daughters. And it's this really kind of moving letter. And then Kirk responds and he says, thank you very much for your service. Just as you are fighting the Viet Cong in Vietnam, I am fighting the Viet Cong in Florida, right? Comparing his fight against these teachers to a war in Vietnam. And I think that gets a lot to kind of the ethos of Claude Kirk. There's another great, fascinating figure that I did an oral history with. Her name is Marjorie Hand. Um, she went on strike. She actually went on a countywide strike in 1967 in Broward County. During the time of the 68 strike, she was under a court injunction. Um, and she was not legally, I mean, she was not allowed to strike. The court injunction said if you go on strike, you'll lose your teacher's license. She opted to go on strike, whereas a lot of other Broward County teachers didn't, but she said she felt she had to at this moment. And she loses her job. And when she loses her job, she ends up going to graduate school at the University of Southern Mississippi, where she helps integrate schools and she serves as a white teacher teaching at black schools. And then eventually, I think about 5 years later, she receives her teaching certificate back from the state of Florida, and then she goes back to Florida to teach for the rest of her career. But I think Marjorie's life really talks to kind of this spirit of activism that was occurring during this time period.
Thank you. Our next question here, sometimes folks studying history don't always want to tie it to what's happening today, so feel free to answer as much or as little as you like. But what might readers of this book who are teachers themselves or just workers in general take from this book as they're sort of facing today's political climate?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. One is I, um, one is that I think Claude Kirk helps create this concept of business model efficiency as a form of governance. He's not the first politician to do that, but it has become a mainstay of the modern political or the modern conservative party, where the government and its kind of branches, such as education, are a business. They should be run as a business, and therefore we need to kind of run them as efficiently as possible. I think what the teachers pointed out, and I think what Claude Kirk learned, is that that is an incredibly difficult task because education is not necessarily a business. And so I think if we're trying to look at some of the roots of what is occurring today with Elon Musk's Doge program and stuff like that, I think you actually can look to my book and to Florida to see where some of this, the roots of this kind of ideas on governance came from. For workers and teachers, I think it demonstrates, even though the teachers were pretty demoralized at the end, right? But looking back on it over 50 years later, I think it demonstrates that teachers and workers can be a force for change, that their voice is important, and they really do have a powerful voice. And that voice can create, as Emma Ever says, history and change that will still reverberate 50 years later. And so I think one of the things that's kind of important to understand is that teachers can be at the forefront of political movements. And we've seen that as well in recent years with teacher strikes in West Virginia and Oklahoma, red state teacher strikes. And so I think one of the things that really sticks out to me in this book is that teachers, but workers in general, are, if pushed far enough, can become leaders of change as well through collective activism.
Thank you. Our next question is, since you've been working on this project for such a long time, what are you working on next? Are you pivoting to something completely different or something sort of in the same vein? Just tell us about your future projects.
Yeah, so I've got two projects. One is what I see as the sequel to this book, broadening it a little bit outside of Florida and looking at the education reform movement of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and then culminating with the No Child Left Behind Act. I'm really curious to see how kind of neoliberal ideas of education shaped new ideas of education reform. So looking at like charter schools, the teacher merit pay, the stripping of teacher tenure, and how these policies at some level have become bipartisan for a while, but how these policies also affected teachers' lives at home and their professional lives. And so that's one project. I'm working on an article right now about the Atlanta Freedom Bands, which is a LGBTQIA marching band that's been around since 1993. But the large book project, I think, is what I see as the sequel to this, and examining kind of education reform over the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and then how teachers responded to it and how these reforms were able to kind of shape their lives.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. That was our last question, so we can go ahead and say thanks and goodbye to the audience.
All right. Thank you all very much. There's a code, right, for the book and a link if you want to purchase the book and receive, I think, 40% off. So please purchase the book if you're interested in it.